Right.
Okay, is it true that you met the priest in the graveyard?
Yes, I did. I met him in the graveyard in front of the golden Jesus crucifix that's in my book.
It was at night?
It was at night, and I had to beg my friend to come to the graveyard with me because she was spooked by graveyards. And I met him, and well, of course, he was very handsome, and I instantly fell in love with him. And of course, the fact that he was a priest was more intriguing to me.
Yeah.
And he was just the kindest, most generous, most real Christian priest I'd ever met, because most of the priests I'd met were pretty creepy as a child. So it was very refreshing.
So that seemed to set up a real dynamic between the Catholicism that was pervasive and the prostitutes who were kind of there, a really built-in presence in the town, and yet just kind of sub rosa, just below the surface. So I imagine you had to really work a bit to get their trust at first. I guess living in the town might have made it easier. How did that work?
Well, I think because I had been around in this town for a while, that people knew I was a photographer, and I photographed everything and everybody. I mean, anybody that would want to be photographed too, I would photograph them and give them prints, Mm-hmm. I mean, it was like I was a member of the community, And when I first went, I did have a few problems with the madam's grandson, only because he thought I was really pretty. And he just harassed me, constantly, until he finally got that I was working. I would put my camera on my tripod and move around, and he would chase me around, and I'd say, look, I'm working, just let me take my pictures. And eventually, it took days and days doing this, just being totally focused, and he left me alone. And then, of course, he adored me. We became buddies. We became really good buddies. And then he turned into protecting me, and so then it got even easier. I mean, because he was so generous with his time, and when when I'd be there, he'd stay until I left, and it was great. I mean, he was a really great person.
One of the things that intrigues me is the way the prostitutes seem to be involved in a kind of role play in some cases. Sometimes they're sort of straight on, but there's always a kind of a subtext, like it's their own little story that seems to be going on. And how did that work in your process of shooting them? Did you just sort of tell them just to do whatever they wanted to do, or?
That I did. They really collaborated with me more than any other, subjects I had ever had. Wow. Ever worked with. And one madam told, I would talk to like the madams or the pimps, and I'd say, well, how much do people get paid, and what do they do, and what's the deal here, Yeah. And one madam told me, she said, a prostitute never knows what's going to happen when she goes into a room. She never knows how much she's going to make. I mean, there's always, you have to put down a deposit when you go into a brothel. A client does. But what amount of money or what happens, it's so unpredictable. And so I realized that was the same thing that was happening to me whenever I was with, photographing in a brothel, that who knows? I mean, it's a place, to me, it's full of humanity, and there's a lot of it's so tragic in so many ways. But the more I photographed, the more I understood, too, is why people were going, and why the women were doing it, and how they felt about it, and how I felt about it. And it came down to, it's really none of my business how I feel about it. I have to tell the story of it's very personal too. It's all about my encounter with the women and what we talked about, how long I worked with them, whether it was always, every moment in a brothel was a surprise to, you know, of what could happen.
Yeah.
And what I'd photograph, and what if I'd go into a room with a woman, and what she'd have in there, and what she'd want to use, whether it was a mask or, you know, sexy underwear. So, you know, a lot of the work's been created by what they brought to the table.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I gather that prostitution pays better than the kinds of jobs that they would have ordinarily have had. So
Definitely.
So it becomes a part of a system that is accepted partly for that reason? Is that
Yes,
correct?
I think so. Well, I mean, there are lots of prostitutes that their husbands are in jail, and no one knows what they do. You know, they tell their mother or someone that they work in a tienda, and they don't know the difference. No one knows the difference. And many women do it. They're in college, and they make a lot of money, and they can stay in college. And most, you know, that when I tell people that, they're very surprised. But I met, you know, beautiful young girls doing this just to get through school. Apparently they do this in the big cities. They work at these, women here work at these clubs, you know, these men's clubs,
sure.
doing the same thing,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know. So, and, you know, I met a lot of older women that had been prostitutes all their life. And
Yeah.
the madam in the village had run a brothel for 45 years, but before she was a prostitute. So I encountered that kind of thing a lot. You know, a lot of madams, you know, they get older and they retire, and you know, some people they don't look on it as we do, because it is a part of life. It's accepted by the government as a bad. They say it's a bad necessity. You know what they say in Spanish. You know, and but there are people that help in the government. There are women that work to help prostitutes.
Like social workers?
Like social workers,
Interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found fascinating about these photographs, and I guess a lot of them are in that village, but there's a kind of, there's more of an ambience of tenderness than you usually see or associate with prostitution, say in Europe or America. I know the prostitution section of Amsterdam. It's fascinating, it's interesting, it's a very rich place, but there's more of a coldness there, and just the women that you see hanging out and so forth. And I was wondering, do you think that's true, that there is a more tender sort of attitude? I know it must go in all directions.
I wouldn't use the word tender, but I just think that it's part of the culture.
Yeah.
And you know, women of course not all of Mexico, but I've seen women treated pretty badly and disrespected. And in villages sometimes work so much harder than the men, especially in the coffee bean fields.
Yeah.
You know, they have more stamina for some reason. And so the women, when I talking to some of the women in the brothels, well, they'll tell me about what they do with their money, and they're not only supporting themselves, but they're supporting their mother and their father and their aunt and all these children, and they're buying houses and doing all these things, and so, you know, of course everybody's going to accept this, because everyone's desperate, you know, for money and comfort, and you know, I don't know if this is making sense, but so that's why into the culture it is so much more accepted, I think, because, you know, the women I've met are extremely generous to their families and friends.
It seems to be a Mexican trait, I think.
Of course it is, you know, Mexican people are more generous people, certainly, than in this country.